"I want a divorce," my husband smirked, casually sliding the legal papers across our kitchen counter. "And my lawyer assures me I'm entitled to exactly half of everything." He thought he was leaving me with absolutely nothing, completely unaware that he had just walked away from a record-breaking fortune.
Have you ever poured your entire soul into someone, only to be discarded the moment you were no longer convenient? Share your own stories of survival in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel if you believe in the power of quiet resilience. But to truly understand how I secured my freedom, you have to see how the illusion finally shattered. It all began the night before my world was supposed to end. I stared at the 6 numbers printed on the small slip of paper, the edges trembling slightly between my fingers. The television screen in our modest living room was still flashing the winning lottery sequence. It was a record-breaking jackpot, a sum so unimaginably large it didn't feel real, but the heavy, pounding rhythm of my heart told me it was. For the last 5 years, my husband Mark and I had been drowning, not just in the mundane bills of our suburban life, but in a silent, suffocating emotional distance. I had spent every ounce of my energy trying to bridge the gap between us. I baked his favorite meals. I stayed up late listening to him complain about his corporate job, and I quietly swallowed my own exhaustion from running my small online business. I thought this money would be our salvation. I thought I could run upstairs, wake him up, and tell him we were finally free. But as my foot touched the bottom stair, a cold realization washed over me. When was the last time Mark had looked at me with genuine love? When was the last time he had asked about my day without it turning into a lecture about my shortcomings? A deeply ingrained instinct, born from years of emotional neglect, rooted me to the spot. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. I needed to protect myself first. The woman who had sacrificed everything for her marriage was slowly waking up. I carefully folded the ticket, slipping it into the hidden zipper of my purse. Tomorrow, I would secure my future. Tonight, I would sleep beside a stranger, guarding a secret that would change everything. The next morning, I didn't go to the lottery office. Instead, I drove to the city to meet with a high-tier asset protection attorney I had frantically researched the night before. Sitting in the plush, mahogany-paneled office, I felt completely out of place in my faded cardigan and worn-out jeans. But the lawyer, Mr. Vance, treated me with a quiet, professional respect that I hadn't experienced in my own home for years. I explained my situation, leaving out the emotional turmoil and focusing solely on the logistics. I needed to claim the winnings anonymously. Mr. Vance nodded, understanding immediately. Within hours, we were drawing up the paperwork for an anonymous limited liability company. We named it New Dawn LLC. The LLC would be managed by a trust, completely shielding my identity from the public, and most importantly, from my husband. As I signed the final document, a strange mixture of guilt and immense relief washed over me. Was I betraying my marriage, or was I finally setting a boundary that Mark couldn't bulldoze over? I thought about all the times I had compromised my own dreams so he could pursue his. The business loans I took out in my name because his credit was tied up in his expensive hobbies. The emotional labor of managing his family's expectations while he played the detached provider. Securing this ticket wasn't an act of greed, it was an act of profound self-preservation. When I drove home that afternoon, the golden ticket was safely locked in a vault, legally bound to a faceless entity. I walked through our front door feeling lighter than I had in a decade, ready to see if our marriage could survive without the weight of financial despair. I had no idea the storm was already waiting for me. The morning after I secured the ticket, the house was eerily quiet. I woke up early, the faint glow of the sunrise spilling through the kitchen blinds. I decided to make pancakes, Mark's favorite. Maybe, I thought, with the underlying financial stress secretly lifted from my shoulders, I could finally breathe life back into our home. Maybe I could be the cheerful, carefree wife he always claimed he wanted.
but never allowed me to be. The smell of vanilla and butter filled the air, a warm contrast to the chill that usually permeated our mornings. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. I turned around, a genuine, hopeful smile forming on my lips. "Morning," I said softly, sliding a plate onto the kitchen island. Mark didn't look at the food. He didn't even look at me, not really. His eyes were focused on the sleek leather briefcase he carried. He set it down on the counter with a soft thud that somehow sounded deafening in the quiet kitchen. He was dressed in his sharpest suit, the one he usually reserved for big client meetings. But today was Saturday. My smile slowly faltered. "Is everything okay?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. Mark finally met my gaze, and the expression on his face made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't sadness. It was a terrifying, hollow indifference, laced with a faint, arrogant smirk. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the smooth marble counter until it bumped against his untouched plate of pancakes. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Divorce?" I whispered, my voice breaking. I looked from his cold eyes to the manila envelope. My hands trembled as I reached out, my fingers brushing the harsh edge of the paper. Inside were the official documents, already stamped and meticulously filled out. He had been planning this. For how long? While I was crying myself to sleep, while I was agonizing over our bills, he had been calculating his exit. "It's just not working anymore," Mark said, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. He looked so incredibly detached, as if he were discussing a faulty appliance rather than a 10-year marriage. "We've grown apart. I need more out of life, and frankly, you're holding me back." The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow. Holding him back? I was the one who worked late nights so he could join his weekend golf club. I was the one who handled every domestic crisis so he could focus on his career growth. But the true blow came when I turned the page to the division of assets. My breath hitched. He wasn't just walking away. He was demanding exactly half of everything. Half of the equity in our modest home, half of our joint savings, and most devastatingly, half of my small, struggling online baking business, the only thing I had built entirely on my own. "Your business is a marital asset," he stated, noticing my shock. The smirk returned to his lips, a cruel shadow of the man I once loved. "My lawyer assures me I'm entitled to 50% of its valuation. It's only fair." Fair, the word echoed in my mind, hollow and deeply ironic. Tears pricked my eyes, and I let them fall. I didn't have to fake the heartbreak. The pain of his betrayal was agonizingly real. 10 years of loyalty, of compromising my own soul to keep him comfortable, and he was tossing me aside while trying to strip me of the little I had left. I sank onto the kitchen stool, burying my face in my hands. I sobbed for the girl who had walked down the aisle with so much hope, and for the woman who had slowly faded away in the shadows of this house. Mark sighed, a sound of profound annoyance. "Please don't make this a dramatic scene. Just look over the papers. If you fight this, we'll end up in court, and you'll just lose more money on legal fees." He was banking on my weakness. He was counting on the exhausted, compliant wife he had carefully molded over the years. But as my tears fell, a sudden, blinding clarity washed over me. My grief began to solidify into a quiet, unbreakable resolve. He thought he was taking half of my world. He thought he was leaving me destitute and broken. He had absolutely no idea about the New Dawn LLC. He didn't know that the night before, I had secured a record-breaking fortune that was legally untouchable by these very divorce papers. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped my face.
I looked up at the man who had just destroyed my past, entirely unaware that he had just forfeited my future. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet steadier than it had been in years. "I'll sign them."
Mark's smirk widened into a triumphant smile, completely oblivious to his catastrophic loss. The next few days were a blur of cardboard boxes and the harsh ripping sound of packing tape. Mark immediately moved his things into the guest room, treating our shared home like a temporary hotel, while I was left with the monumental task of dismantling a decade of marriage. As I sorted through our belongings, the physical evidence of my emotional erasure became glaringly obvious. Every closet, every shelf was dominated by his life. His expensive golf clubs, his framed corporate awards, his meticulously tailored suits. My presence was relegated to the margins, a single shelf of baking books, a small drawer of craft supplies, a few faded photographs where my smile looked forced. I found an old anniversary card I had handmade for him 3 years ago, tossed carelessly in a junk drawer beneath a pile of dead batteries. The pain of seeing it was sharp, a stinging reminder of how deeply I had poured my heart into a vessel with a hole in the bottom. But underneath the pain, the steel core of my new resolve held firm. I carefully placed the card into a trash bag. I wasn't just packing up my clothes. I was packing up my dignity. Mark watched me struggle with heavy boxes from the living room couch, completely absorbed in his phone, not once offering to help. He believed he was breaking me down, forcing me to surrender my comfort. He had no idea that with every box I sealed, I was building an impenetrable fortress around my future. I was playing the part of the defeated wife flawlessly, while inside, the architect of a multi-million-dollar empire was quietly taking notes. The meeting at his lawyer's office was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The conference room smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee, designed to intimidate. Mark sat tall, exuding a polished confidence, while his attorney, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Davis, looked at me with thinly veiled pity. He pushed the final settlement agreement across the mahogany table. "As we discussed," Mr. Davis began, his tone dripping with patronizing patience, "Mark is retaining the house and taking a 50% share of the current liquid assets, including the assessed value of your baking business. In exchange, he is willing to waive any claim to future alimony. I suggest you sign. It is a very generous offer under the circumstances." Generous. The word practically choked me, but I forced my expression to remain meek and overwhelmed. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking just enough to sell the performance. I read through the clauses, seeing the legal terminology that stripped me of the modest safety net I had worked so hard to weave. Yet my eyes mentally superimposed the documents of New Dawn LLC over their greedy paperwork. The millions sitting safely in a trust were entirely absent from these pages. I looked at Mark. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He was busy adjusting his expensive watch. I took a deep breath, letting out a soft, defeated sigh, and signed my name on the dotted lines. 1, 2, 3 signatures. With every stroke of the pen, I legally severed him from my impending fortune. Mr. Davis smiled a tight, victorious smile, and Mark finally looked up, his shoulders relaxing. They thought they had won the war, completely unaware that I had just secured the ultimate victory. Moving out day was quiet. I had rented a small box truck, loading the last of my maker possessions entirely by myself. Mark stood on the front porch, sipping a cup of artisanal coffee I had bought for him the week before. He watched me struggle with a heavy box of baking tins, making no move to assist. "You know, you didn't have to rush out," he said, his voice carrying a fake, hollow sympathy. "You could have stayed in the guest room until you found a proper place." I paused, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was astounding. He wanted the comfort of appearing generous, without actually doing the work of being kind. "I think a clean break is best," I replied quietly, hoisting the box into the back of the truck. "Goodbye, Mark."
I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was already turning back toward the house, stepping out of my life as easily as one steps out of a room. A solitary tear rolled down my cheek, not a tear of sorrow, but one of immense, profound relief. The heavy chain of his expectations, his constant criticisms, and his emotional unavailability had finally snapped. I drove away from the beautiful suburban house that had been my prison, my bank account nearly empty, my business cut in half. To the world, I was a tragic casualty of a failed marriage, starting over with nothing. But as my hand brushed against my purse, feeling the outline of my lawyer's business card, a genuine, radiant smile broke across my face. I was completely, beautifully free.
My new sanctuary was a tiny third-floor walk-up apartment on the older side of town. The paint in the hallway was peeling, and the radiator clanked loudly in the middle of the night, but to me, it felt like a palace. I had intentionally chosen a modest place. Until the divorce decree was finalized by the judge, a process that would take another excruciating 60 days, I needed to maintain the absolute illusion of my financial struggle. Any sudden, lavish spending could trigger an audit, alerting Mark's vicious legal team to my newly acquired wealth. So I furnished my little apartment with thrift store finds and clearance items. The first night, I sat on a lumpy, second-hand sofa, eating instant noodles from a paper bowl. The silence of the apartment was entirely different from the suffocating quiet of my old house. This silence was peaceful. It was mine. There was no one to criticize the smell of my cooking, no one to complain about the television volume, no one to make me feel small in my own space. I opened my laptop and checked the secure portal Mr. Vance had set up for me. The account balance of New Dawn LLC stared back at me, a string of zeros that defied logic. I traced the numbers on the screen with trembling fingers. I didn't want a yacht, and I didn't want designer clothes. I just wanted safety. I wanted the freedom to breathe without asking for permission. That night, I slept more soundly on an old mattress on the floor than I ever had in our expensive king-sized bed. The waiting period for the divorce tested my patience, but it also gave me time to plan. My online baking business, which Mark had so callously undervalued and taken half the profits from, was still my passion. I couldn't expand it publicly yet, but New Dawn LLC provided the perfect shadow to operate from. I contacted Mr. Vance and instructed him to use the LLC to discreetly purchase a small, failing commercial bakery on the outskirts of the city. The transaction was completely anonymous. To the outside world, a faceless corporation had bought the property. I began visiting the empty bakery at night, unlocking the doors with a key that belonged to a company no one knew I owned. I walked through the dusty, flour-coated kitchen, visualizing the future. I imagined gleaming stainless steel ovens, rows of cooling racks filled with my signature pastries, and a team of happy employees. I was laying the groundwork for my dream, brick by unseen brick. During the day, I continued fulfilling my small online orders from my tiny apartment kitchen, sending half of my meager earnings to Mark's account as legally required. It stung to wire him that money, knowing he was probably using it to entertain his friends and complain about his leech of an ex-wife. But I smiled through the frustration. Every dollar I sent him was an investment in my camouflage, the camouflage that was hiding an empire he would never, ever touch. 3 weeks before the divorce was set to be finalized, I ran into Mark at the local supermarket. I was standing in the baking aisle, carefully comparing the prices of bulk flour for my modest home orders. My basket was filled with discount sugar and generic butter. I heard his distinct, confident laugh before I saw him. Mark turned the corner, dressed in a crisp polo shirt, holding a basket containing artisan cheeses, expensive wine, and premium steaks. He stopped short when he saw me,
his eyes flicking down to my faded jeans and then to the sad contents of my shopping basket. A flicker of something akin to pity, or perhaps vindication, crossed his face.
"Still scraping by, I see," he said, his tone dripping with a patronizing sympathy that made my stomach turn. "If you ever need a small loan to keep your little hobby afloat, let my lawyer know. I'm not entirely heartless." I gripped the handle of my plastic basket, my knuckles turning white. The old me would have shrunk away, deeply humiliated by his condescension.
I would have internalized his mockery as proof of my own inadequacy. But the new me, the silent owner of a multi-million-dollar trust, simply looked at him. I saw the arrogance masking his deep insecurity. He needed to see me struggling to validate his cruel choices. "I'm doing just fine, Mark," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and polite. "Enjoy your steaks." I walked past him, my head held high. As I stood in the checkout line, paying for my discount groceries with a worn debit card, I felt a profound sense of power. True wealth wasn't what was in his basket. It was the quiet, unshakable peace I carried in my chest. As the days crawled toward the final court date, my nights became my true sanctuary. The commercial bakery I had purchased through New Dawn LLC was a dusty, neglected warehouse on the edge of the arts district. I couldn't risk hiring a high-profile design team just yet, so I became the midnight architect of my own future.
Every evening, after fulfilling my small online orders and dutifully transferring half the meager profits to Mark's account, I drove to the empty building. I brought folding chairs, graph paper, and measuring tapes. Under the harsh glare of a single utility light, I sketched out my dream.
I mapped out where the massive proofing ovens would go, where the display cases would shine, and where the bustling kitchen staff would create magic. I hired a discreet local contractor, Mr. Henderson, communicating entirely through an encrypted email address provided by my lawyer. When Mr. Henderson needed to meet on site, I introduced myself merely as the local liaison for the parent company. I wore a hard hat and plain clothes, discussing load-bearing walls and ventilation systems with a quiet authority that surprised even myself. Standing in the center of the echoing space, smelling the faint scent of old sawdust and wet concrete, I felt an overwhelming surge of healing. For years, I had been told my dreams were too small, too domestic, too insignificant to matter. Mark had constantly diminished my ambitions to elevate his own, but in this cavernous, dusty room, my dreams were taking physical shape. I was no longer a supporting character in his life. I was the sole creator of my own universe. The morning of the final divorce decree was gray and heavily overcast. The courthouse felt cold, the sterile marble floors echoing with the footsteps of broken families. I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, wearing a simple, inexpensive navy dress. When Mark arrived, he didn't sit next to me. He stood near the window, checking his phone, looking utterly bored by the inconvenience of ending our decade-long marriage. When the bailiff finally called us in, the procedure was painfully brief. The judge, a stern woman with tired eyes, reviewed the settlement agreement we had signed weeks ago. She asked the standard questions, confirming that we both understood the permanent division of our assets. "Is this an accurate representation of all marital properties and finances?" she asked, looking over her reading glasses. "Yes, Your Honor," Mark answered quickly, confidently. "Yes, Your Honor," I echoed, my voice steady. Technically, it was the truth. The lottery ticket belonged to an LLC, completely divorced from my personal marital estate before the proceedings even began. The judge brought her wooden gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack. Divorce granted. That was it. 10 years of sacrifice, of swallowed tears and unreciprocated love, legally dissolved in less than 10 minutes. As we walked out of the courtroom, Mark turned to me. He adjusted his expensive tie, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Well," he said lightly, "good luck out there. I hope you figure things out. He turned and walked toward the elevators, stepping out of my life for good. I watched the doors close behind him, a heavy, suffocating weight lifting from my lungs. The invisible chains shattered. The 60-day camouflage was over. I was finally truly free.
The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke up before the sun. I didn't make instant coffee, and I didn't look at my sad thrift store furniture. Instead, I opened my laptop and sent a single one-line email to Mr. Vance, my attorney. Release the funds. Within hours, the world shifted. I drove to the warehouse, but this time I wasn't creeping in under the cover of darkness.
I unlocked the front door and let the morning light flood into the dusty space. Today, I wasn't the anonymous liaison. I was the owner. I called Mr. Henderson, the contractor, and gave him the green light to double the crew and expedite the renovations. I ordered top-of-the-line Italian convection ovens, custom marble countertops, and gleaming brass fixtures. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to spend without fear, without looking over my shoulder to see if Mark's lawyers were watching. But the most emotional moment didn't come from signing massive checks. It came later that afternoon, when I stood alone in my tiny apartment kitchen and officially shut down my struggling online business. I deleted the old website, the one Mark owned half of, the one that represented my pain and subjugation. I sat on my lumpy secondhand sofa and cried. I sobbed until my chest ached, releasing the years of belittlement, the terror of the divorce, and the exhausting burden of keeping my secret. But as the tears dried, they were replaced by a profound, radiant joy. The illusion was dead. From its ashes, the real new dawn was ready to rise, and I was going to build an empire so bright it would blind anyone who had ever doubted me. 3 weeks after the final decree, my cheap prepaid cell phone buzzed loudly on the kitchen counter. I was busy reviewing the finalized logo designs for the bakery, a beautiful, elegant sunburst over a stylized wheat stalk. I glanced at the caller ID and my heart skipped a beat. It was Eleanor, Mark's mother. For years, Eleanor had treated me like an unpaid housekeeper, constantly criticizing my cooking, my clothes, and my inability to push her son high enough up the corporate ladder. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello, Eleanor." "Finally," her sharp, nasal voice cut through the line. "I've been trying to reach Mark for 2 days. His house is a disaster. He hired some ridiculous cleaning service that ruined my grandmother's antique rug, and he can't find the good silverware. Where did you pack it?" The sheer entitlement of her question left me momentarily speechless. They had kicked me out, stripped me of my home, and yet the moment his manufactured perfection began to crack, I was still the one expected to fix it. A calm, cool wave of detachment washed over me. I wasn't her daughter-in-law anymore. I was nobody's caretaker but my own. "I have no idea where the silverware is, Eleanor," I said gently. "Mark packed the dining room while I was moving out. You'll have to ask him." "Well, he is entirely overwhelmed," she huffed defensively. "He's working late, and the house is falling apart without—" She stopped, suddenly realizing what she was admitting. "I'm sure he'll manage," I replied, a soft, genuine smile touching my lips. "He has exactly the life he asked for. Please don't call this number again. Goodbye, Eleanor." I hung up, blocking the number immediately. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. 6 months after the final divorce decree, New Dawn Bakery officially opened its doors to the public. I stood behind the pristine, glass-encased counter, my hands resting on the cool marble, trying to steady my racing heart. The transformation of the dusty warehouse was nothing short of miraculous. Sunlight poured through the massive front windows, illuminating the gleaming brass fixtures, the warm pastel walls, and the endless rows of delicate, handcrafted pastries. I wore a crisp white chef's coat with the elegant Sunburst logo embroidered in gold thread over my heart. When my manager, a bright and energetic woman named Sarah, unlocked the front doors at precisely 7 in the morning, I held my breath. At first, there was only the gentle chime of the doorbell. Then, a slow, steady stream of customers began to trickle in, drawn by the aggressive local marketing campaign I had quietly funded. By 8 o'clock, the trickle had turned into a flood. A line wrapped around the block, the air filled with the rich, intoxicating aroma of freshly brewed espresso, buttery croissants, and warm vanilla. I worked the counter alongside my staff, boxing up cakes and pouring coffee, moving with a fluid, joyous energy I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Every time a customer complimented the decor or closed their eyes in delight after tasting a pastry, a profound, healing warmth spread through my chest. I wasn't just selling baked goods, I was serving pieces of my reclaimed soul. I had built the sanctuary with my own vision, my own resilience, and the secret fortune that had given me the ultimate shield. By the time we sold out at 2 in the afternoon, I was physically exhausted but spiritually soaring. The success of New Dawn Bakery was explosive. Within weeks, we were the talk of the city. Local food bloggers featured our artisan breads, and morning news segments showcased our intricate cake designs. I remained mostly behind the scenes, pouring my energy into expanding the menu and managing my growing team of employees. I was perfectly content letting the bakery's reputation speak for itself, shielding my personal identity from the media glare. Yet, as my star rose, whispers of Mark's steady decline began to reach me through mutual acquaintances. I never sought out the information, but in a mid-sized city, gossip was inevitable. A former neighbor, stopping by for a dozen cupcakes, mentioned that Mark's prized lawn had turned entirely brown and overgrown. Another acquaintance noted that he had been passed over for the senior partnership at his firm, the very promotion I had spent years helping him prepare for by hosting endless, exhausting dinner parties for his bosses. Without my invisible labor, the perfectly managed household, the emotional buffering, the meticulous scheduling, his meticulously crafted image was falling apart. He had wanted a life unburdened by my limitations, only to discover that I was the foundation holding his entire world together. Hearing these updates brought me no malicious joy, only a quiet, profound validation. I didn't wish him ill, but I was deeply thankful I was no longer the collateral damage of his ambition. I washed my hands of his struggles, focusing entirely on kneading the dough of my own beautiful, flourishing future. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet day where the bakery smelled intensely of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. The lunchtime rush had subsided, and I was at the front counter, carefully arranging a fresh batch of fruit tarts in the display case. The gentle chime of the front door echoed through the shop. I didn't look up immediately, my attention focused on perfectly placing a glazed strawberry. "I need 24 assorted pastries for a corporate meeting, please. Make it look expensive," a voice demanded. My hand froze midair. The sharp, arrogant cadence of the voice was instantly recognizable. The years of conditioning sent a brief, phantom spike of anxiety through my chest, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by an unshakable calm. I slowly lifted my head and looked across the polished marble counter. Mark stood there, shaking the rain off his expensive trench coat. He looked older. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. He was staring at his phone, completely oblivious to who was standing right in front of him. He tapped his foot impatiently on the immaculate tile floor. "Hello? Is anyone working the register?" he snapped, finally looking up. His eyes met mine. The annoyance on his face melted into absolute staggering shock. His jaw slightly parted, his phone slowly lowering to his side. He looked from my face to the pristine embroidered chef's coat, and then his gaze darted around the luxurious, bustling bakery, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the busy kitchen staff visible through the swinging glass doors. The silence between us stretched, heavy and electric. Mark blinked, rubbing his eyes, as if he were trying to dispel a hallucination. What "What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice lacking all of his usual polished authority. He looked at the flour dusting my apron, a sneer automatically forming on his lips as his old superiority complex kicked in to protect his ego. "Did you actually manage to get a job here?"
I'm surprised they let you work the front counter. This place is entirely out of your league. I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I stood tall, resting my hands comfortably on the counter. I'm not an employee, Mark, I said, my voice steady, calm, and carrying completely across the quiet shop. His sneer faltered. Then what are you doing wearing the uniform?
He scoffed, though uncertainty was creeping into his eyes. Just then, Sarah, my manager, walked out from the back office carrying a stack of invoices. "Excuse me, boss," she said politely, handing me the paperwork. "The suppliers just confirmed the shipment for the new commercial mixers. Should I authorize the payment from the corporate account?" "Yes, Sarah, go ahead."
"Thank you," I replied warmly, signing the top sheet without breaking eye contact with Mark. Mark's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to take hold. His eyes darted frantically around the massive, expensive establishment. The custom marble, the imported ovens, the sheer scale of the operation. He did the mental math, realizing instantly that this wasn't a small, struggling hobby. This was a multi-million-dollar enterprise. "Boss?" he whispered, the word catching painfully in his throat. You own this?"
I do, I answered simply. I offered no explanations, no elaborate stories about silent investors or hidden bank accounts. I owed him nothing, least of all the truth about the lottery ticket that had bought my freedom. Let him drown in his own confusion. "But how?" Mark's voice pitched higher, a desperate edge of panic bleeding through. "When we divorced, you had nothing. You took half of that pathetic little online business. This place? This costs millions. How could you possibly afford this? Did you hide assets from me?" The old accusatory anger flared up, but it was hollow, lacking any real power. "The division of assets was finalized by the judge, Mark," I reminded him gently, almost pityingly. "You got exactly what you asked for. You got the house, the savings, and your freedom. I got a clean slate." He stared at me, his mind desperately trying to reconcile the broken, exhausted wife he had discarded with the radiant, powerful woman standing behind the counter of a wildly successful empire. He had demanded half of my struggles, leaving me with a fraction of our past. He had no claim to my present and absolutely no stake in my future. "Did you still want those pastries for your meeting?" I asked politely, gesturing to the display case. "They're $40 a dozen." Mark looked at the delicate tarts, then back at me. Humiliation, thick and suffocating, finally settled over him. He slowly took a step back, shaking his head. Without a single word, he turned around and walked out the glass door, stepping back into the cold rain. I watched him go, feeling the last lingering ghost of my past wash away. I took a deep, cleansing breath, turned back to my display case, and perfectly adjusted the final strawberry. After Mark left, I stood by the large storefront window, watching the steady, rhythmic downpour of rain against the glass. The heavy droplets traced slow, mesmerizing paths down the pane, blurring the city street into a wash of gray and soft streetlights. The sound was a comforting, continuous hum, washing away the lingering tension of his unexpected visit. I thought back to the nights I used to lay awake in our suburban home, listening to the suffocating silence that felt more like a weapon than a comfort. I had spent years fearing his disapproval, twisting myself into knots to avoid the very look of disgust he had just aimed at me. Yet standing here now, wrapped in the warmth of my own success, his opinion felt entirely weightless. I walked back into the bustling kitchen, greeted by the comforting symphony of clinking whisks and the ambient hum of massive convection ovens. Sarah handed me a fresh cup of chamomile tea, her eyes conveying a silent, supportive understanding. She didn't ask questions about the arrogant man in the trench coat, and I didn't offer any explanations. The past was a closed book. As I sipped the warm tea, listening to the soothing, looping rhythm of the rain tapping against the skylights above, I realized that my healing wasn't just about the money. The fortune had provided the shield, but the peace I felt in this exact moment, the quiet, unshakable sanctuary of my own mind, was something I had built entirely by myself.
I had finally reclaimed my environment, and it was beautiful.
The following weekend, the bell above the bakery door chimed, bringing in a face I hadn't seen since the final, agonizing days of packing up my old house. It was my younger sister, Maya. During my marriage, Maya and I had drifted apart. Mark's polished charm and manipulative generosity had easily won over my family, making me look like the perpetually ungrateful, stressed-out wife. When the divorce happened, Maya had been deeply confused by my calm surrender of our home and my business, assuming I had simply given up. Now she stood in the center of New Dawn Bakery, her umbrella dripping softly onto the entrance mat, her jaw slightly open, as she took in the elegant pastel walls and the line of eager customers. I stepped out from behind the counter, wiping my hands on my apron, a cautious but genuine smile forming. "Maya," I said softly. She blinked, pulling her gaze away from a towering, colorful display of macarons to look at me. She looked at my crisp chef's coat, the glowing golden logo, and the undeniable aura of quiet authority I now carried. I saw the article in the local food blog," she stammered, pulling a printed page from her purse. "It said the anonymous owner of New Dawn was finally stepping into the light. I couldn't believe it." She took a step forward, her eyes welling with tears. "You let him take the house. You let him take your little online shop. And all this time you were building this?" I reached out, gently taking her hand. "I didn't just build a bakery, Maya," I told her, my voice steady and filled with pride. "I built a life where I never have to ask for permission to exist." We sat in a quiet corner of the bakery, sharing a pot of Earl Grey tea and a plate of warm, buttery croissants. The heavy rain from earlier in the week had given way to a crisp, bright afternoon. Maya traced the rim of her teacup, her expression weighed down by a heavy, visible guilt. "I owe you a massive apology," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "For years, I bought into Mark's narrative. I thought he was this endlessly patient provider, and I thought you were just difficult to please. I never saw how small he made you feel until you left him." I reached across the small table, resting my hand over hers. I harbored no anger toward my sister. Mark's emotional manipulation was a masterclass in deception. He only ever showed the world his most generous, flawless angles. "You didn't know," I reassured her gently. "He designed it that way." The emotional toll of that marriage wasn't something he ever let happen in public. Maya wiped a tear from her cheek. "When you didn't fight him in the divorce, I was so angry with you. I thought you had completely lost your self-worth. But looking around this place," she paused, taking in the thriving, joyful environment I had cultivated. "You were just making a clean break. You were saving your energy for something spectacular." For the first time in a decade, I felt like a true sister again, unburdened by the constant need to defend my reality. The bakery hummed around us, a testament to the beautiful things that can grow when you finally cut away the dead weight. Winter arrived a few months later, painting the city in a serene, quiet blanket of white. As the bakery's success stabilized, I finally allowed myself to step away for a long weekend, retreating to a secluded cabin I had recently purchased through the LLC. It sat on the edge of a deep, entirely still lake. The first morning there, I wrapped myself in a thick wool blanket and sat on the wooden porch, cradling a mug of hot cocoa.
I watched the heavy, perfectly symmetrical snowflakes fall gently from the gray sky, settling onto the unfrozen center of the lake. They vanished upon impact, creating endless, mesmerizing ripples on the dark water. The profound silence of the environment was intoxicating.
There were no demands, no criticisms, no exhausting performances required. I reflected on the frantic, terrified woman I had been a year ago, clutching a winning lottery ticket in a dark hallway, desperately terrified of her own husband. Now, the wealth was just a tool, a silent, protective barrier that allowed me to sit on this porch and simply exist.
The money hadn't bought happiness, but it had bought the ultimate, untouchable freedom to heal. I was the sole author of my own peace. The storm of my past marriage had officially passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched landscape where I could finally breathe. I opened my eyes, listening to the soft, rhythmic hush of the snow piling up on the wooden railing, watching the gentle ripples on the water, and feeling entirely, beautifully whole.
When I returned to the city, a thick manila envelope was waiting on the desk in my back office. I recognized the return address immediately. Mr. Davis, Mark's ruthless divorce attorney. A brief instinctual flash of the old dread spiked in my chest, but it dissolved rapidly as I remembered the ironclad armor of New Dawn LLC. I sliced the envelope open with a calm, steady hand. It was a formal demand letter. Mark, having clearly connected my massive presence at the bakery with his own rapidly deteriorating financial state, was attempting to reopen the divorce settlement. The letter cited fraudulent concealment of assets and threatened an exhaustive forensic audit of my finances leading up to our separation. I didn't panic. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed Mr.
Vance, my own attorney. When he answered, I read him the desperate demands. A low, genuinely amused chuckle echoed through the receiver. "Let them audit everything you owned," Mr. Vance said smoothly. "On the day of your divorce, your personal net worth was exactly what you stated under oath. The LLC was a completely separate, legally sealed entity funded by an anonymous trust. They have absolutely no legal standing to pierce that veil, especially since he voluntarily waived all rights to future discovery to rush the settlement." I hung up the phone, a deep, victorious smile spreading across my face. I walked over to the shredder in the corner of my office. I fed the heavy, expensive legal paper into the machine, listening to the satisfying, mechanical grind as Mark's final, desperate attempt to control me was reduced to meaningless strips of confetti. The game was truly over. He had bet on my weakness, and he had lost everything. The days following the shredded demand letter were accompanied by a profound, expectant silence. A part of me, still carrying the bruised muscle memory of our marriage, braced for a spectacular retaliation. I expected process servers to disrupt my morning rush or angry voicemails to flood my phone. But nothing came. Mr. Vance's legal armor was impenetrable, and even Mark's aggressive attorney had to eventually concede that dragging a baseless claim into court would only result in a humiliating loss of legal fees. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the definitive end of an era. The last frayed thread connecting me to the man who had constantly belittled my existence was permanently severed. I threw myself into the rhythm of the bakery with a renewed, unburdened vigor. I spent my mornings covered in white flour, developing new pastry recipes alongside my head bakers, feeling the satisfying, elastic stretch of fresh dough between my hands. The physical labor was deeply grounding, a sharp contrast to the exhausting mental gymnastics I used to perform just to keep the peace in my old household. We introduced a new line of seasonal tarts, and I found myself laughing loudly and freely with my staff, a sound that used to earn me severe, disapproving glances from my ex-husband. Every night, when I turned the key to lock the bakery doors, I looked back at the glowing interior with an overwhelming sense of pride. I had weathered the final, desperate storm of his entitlement.
The fortress I had built under the cover of darkness was now standing securely in the broad daylight, absolutely impervious to his resentment.
As New Dawn Bakery flourished beyond my wildest expectations, the overwhelming abundance of my life began to shift my perspective. The anonymous trust had given me a lifeline when I was drowning in an emotionally hollow marriage. But I realized I didn't just want to build a profitable business, I wanted to build a sanctuary for others.
I remembered the sheer terror of sitting in my old kitchen, feeling financially trapped by Mark's control over our joint accounts, believing I had no viable exit. I never wanted another woman to feel that deeply paralyzing helplessness. Quietly, without seeking any press or public recognition, I launched a paid apprenticeship program within the bakery. I reached out to local community centers and women's shelters, offering full-time, salaried positions to women navigating difficult domestic transitions. When the first group of 3 women walked through the glass doors, looking nervous and uncertain, I saw my own reflection in their eyes. I didn't offer them pity. I offered them a pristine chef's coat and a steady paycheck.
I taught them how to measure ingredients with precision, how to perfectly temper chocolate, and, most importantly, how to stand tall behind a counter and command respect. Watching them slowly regain their confidence, transforming from hesitant shadows into vibrant, capable artisans, healed a lingering ache in my own heart. The bakery became a bustling, joyful sisterhood. We were a collective of women who had all survived our own private storms, now working side by side to create something fundamentally sweet, nourishing, and entirely our own. One bright Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after the judge's gavel had dissolved my marriage, I sat in Mr. Vance's mahogany-paneled office once again. The contrast between this visit and my first could not have been more striking. I was no longer the terrified, exhausted wife in a faded cardigan pleading for an anonymous shield. I sat tall in a tailored blazer, the confident owner of a rapidly expanding enterprise. The statute of limitations on any frivolous asset disputes regarding your divorce has officially expired, Mr. Vance stated, sliding a polished leather folder across his desk. Mark has no legal recourse, no standing, and absolutely no way to challenge the trust. You are completely in the clear. A deep, cleansing breath left my lungs. The anonymity of the LLC had been a vital cocoon, a necessary deception to protect my future from a man who wanted to take half of my soul. But I no longer needed to hide behind a faceless corporate entity. I reached for the thick silver pen on his desk and signed the amended registration documents. With a few strokes of ink, I officially transferred the primary ownership title from New Dawn LLC directly into my own legal name. I was no longer an invisible liaison or an anonymous beneficiary. I was the founder, the owner, and the undeniable architect of my own empire. Walking out of the law firm that afternoon, the city felt different. The street seemed wider, the air felt cleaner, and the bright morning sun warmed my face with the brilliant promise of an unhidden life. That evening, long after the staff had gone home and the display cases had been scrubbed clean, I stayed behind in the quiet kitchen. The massive ovens had cooled, leaving a lingering, comforting warmth in the air. I gathered a small assortment of ingredients: flour, sugar, generic butter, and cheap vanilla extract. It was the exact recipe I used to bake in my tiny apartment when I was terrified, lonely, and surviving on the margins. I mixed the dough by hand, feeling the coarse sugar dissolve beneath my fingers. As the simple cookies baked, filling the empty room with their nostalgic, humble aroma, I sat on a stool and confronted the final ghost of my past, my own residual anger. For so long, I had harbored a quiet, burning resentment toward Mark for the years he had stolen from me, for the constant emotional neglect, and for the sheer audacity of his greed. But sitting in the heart of the beautiful world I had built, that anger finally felt irrelevant. I realized that my hatred was just another way of keeping him in my life. I didn't want him there anymore.
When the oven timer chimed, I pulled the tray out and looked at the simple, golden cookies. I realized I had finally forgiven myself for staying as long as I did. I had done the best I could with the love I had. The pain of that marriage was simply the intense pressure required to forge my current strength. I ate a warm cookie in the silence of my bakery, letting the last heavy drop of bitterness wash away, leaving only peace. The first anniversary of New Dawn Bakery's grand opening was a vibrant, overwhelming celebration. The line of eager customers stretched all the way down the block, and the storefront was decorated in bright, cascading floral arrangements sent by Maya and my loyal staff. I stood near the front window, taking a brief moment to step back and absorb the beautiful chaos. Sarah was efficiently managing the register with a bright smile, while my new apprentices proudly arranged rows of intricate, sparkling pastries. The community we had built was thriving, deeply rooted in resilience and mutual support. I reached into the pocket of my crisp chef's coat, my fingers brushing against a small, framed replica of the winning lottery ticket. I kept it there not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder of the catalyst that had forced me to choose myself. The money had provided the ultimate legal shield, outsmarting a man who had confidently plotted my financial ruin. But the money hadn't baked the bread. It hadn't designed the logo, trained the staff, or mended the broken relationship with my sister. The true jackpot wasn't the millions sitting safely in my bank account. It was the unshakable discovery of my own profound worth. I watched the golden morning sunlight spill across the marble countertops, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I took a deep, steadying breath, smelling the vanilla, the fresh coffee, and the undeniable scent of freedom. The illusion of my past was gone forever, and the dawn I had waited for all my life had finally beautifully arrived.